Now, although the U.S. presidential election is still a bit away, the campaign has begun in earnest. Now, of course, whoever is in the White House, if that's Republican, Democrat, that will have massive impact on the situation around the world, but in particular, policy of Ukraine and Russia. So to get more on that policy now, what potentially could happen, is my guest sitting down with me, Jason J. Smart, who is a political commentator and Central and Eastern European expert. Jason, good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
Now, let's look at the candidates. I mean, they're not all equal. Let's go on the Republican side. We know a bit about Trump. We know a little bit about DeSantis, Nikki Haley. So give us the kind of, let's say, details here. What different types of policy could we see potentially if we have these different folks make it to the White House?
Well, I think it's important to delineate within the Republican Party. There's probably two major camps. One is more friendly to Europe, more friendly to Ukraine-related issues, such as Nikki Haley, has more of a global view, understands the importance of why the war in Ukraine must be won. As you know, for instance, Haley's position is that we must win in Ukraine if we wish to prevent World War III. This is quite in contrast, though, to the other position being taken, that is the Trumpist. World Trump does not view the war in Ukraine as being necessary for U.S. interest, and for that matter, does not view Europe as being particularly important for the United States. As you recall, Trump was very keen to even pull out of NATO. And so if we look at the difference here, it's quite black and white. Now, I think that it's most likely, given the U.S. general public's support for Ukraine and support for Europe, I think it's unlikely that many candidates will take positions analogous to those of Trump. However, DeSantis, for instance, expressed his let's say, doubts as to whether the war in Ukraine was necessary or whether the U.S. should be so totally invested in Ukraine as it has been. And so this is going to be a significant election that will definitely shape what happens further with not only Ukraine, but also European-American relations.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's the amount of money that has been given by the United States to Ukraine is immense. I mean, far billions ahead of what any of the other allies have given. I think that's part of the problem. I mean, it's reasonable to expect other allies to give more. Let's look at that for a minute, because I'm curious. If, let's say, the European Union would step in more, let's say if Germany, also very small in terms of contribution, if they would step in more for arm aids, more for weapons, more for support for Ukraine, would you see that the Republicans would then also potentially support more policy to continue? Is it a question of that?
I would agree with that statement. I think that, there is one point that Trump did hit on as president, and we see that reflected today as well in what you just mentioned, which is that Europe does not contribute as much to defense of Europe as the U.S. has historically vis-a-vis its support of NATO. And I think in the support of Ukraine as well, we see that it is, yes, far less than what the United States has given, billions less. Major countries such as Germany do have the potential, if they chose to give billions of dollars of assistance, but they choose not to. Rather trying to always go through the European Union to slow the process and also to cheapen the cost. And this is something that I think that the Americans are tired of, and that is one point that Trump did make a number of times, is that why is the United States subsidizing NATO? What is NATO doing for the United States? And there was, as you recall back then, there are a lot of countries who are not meeting the 2% minimum contribution. And now we see, though, he did have an impact on that. Many countries then moved quickly to increase the amount of military spending they had domestically. And the reflection of that today, though, is that still countries in Europe are dragging their feet to really meet a serious threat that is in their own territory in Europe, which is the Russian war against Ukraine.
You mentioned NATO and that 2% marker of GDP. I think it's significant. There's only, I think, the entire alliance, I think 7 countries that are meeting that threshold or exceeding it even. And those are going to be all those Baltic states, that's Estonia, sending everything they got, really, right? Then you've got Latvia, you've got Poland as well. Poland as a new kind of military powerhouse. But then, of course, not on the list. That is Germany, right? A country that could afford much, much more, but it just isn't, right?
Well, Germany has the potential to, and that's, I think, very disappointing, because Germany does try to project itself as it is a major player in Europe, obviously, but globally as well. And if you wish to take that role, if you truly wish to be the most important country in Europe, or the kingmaker, let's say, to not meet the military obligation is sort of, I think, short-sighted. Because what is this, other than economic power that it has? What is it able to do defense-wise? And it could be doing much more to defend Ukraine, which thereby would defend Europe. So if you wish to be the center of Europe, as it tries to project itself to be, it would be wise to really be supporting Ukraine far more than what they currently are.
Yeah. I mean, I was struck by the sea change, Zeitenwende in German, that Olaf Scholz announced. It's a bit slow. It's a very slow sea change. But I'm just curious what you think. I think just recently we had a very different type of Olaf Scholz. We're used to this very librarian-style, non-emotional chancellor, but he had this impassioned reaction to some of these protesters in Germany, calling him a warmonger. And I think it's something we haven't seen before. And really, I think it surprised many, but he was actually very positive about stepping in to really support Ukraine. So do you think that might actually now jolt a bit more into what Berlin will pay for all of this?
Well, I think Scholz has probably been one of the most interesting figures in the course of this war in his evolution. As you recall, when the war began, Germany not only lagged behind promising its 5,000 helmets, but it was totally unwilling to send tanks. As you remember, that was always the question, will they send tanks? Will they send tanks? And finally, Germany has changed, and it's become much more active in its desire to support Ukraine. Unfortunately, I think that Germany is hamstrung by a few things, such as domestic protesters, which are not the majority of the German population at all. They represent a very small group, but that group is very vocal. And
the loudest, right?
The loudest. And so if you are the loudest, you do draw attention. Germany also has a problem with the significant number of emigres who emigrated from Russia to Germany, who are actively against the war as well, supportive instead of Russia. But the fact is, in a society such as Germany, where the majority is supportive of Ukraine, you must do what the majority wishes to see and to do. And in this case, it's to defend Ukraine, because ultimately that is in Germany's own interest.
Let's go back over to the States. And I think also when you mentioned Nikki Haley, she said something recently also, I think it was a town hall meeting, about the existential threat, not just, oh, it's a faraway place. This is something, freedom matters, and whoever wins in Ukraine, that will prevent World War III. So she really made that case that this is important to the American people. This is not just some faraway war, but this is something about really moving forward national interest, freedom for Europe, for the whole world. Do you think that's going to resonate finally with the Republican base?
I think that it's the wisest thing for her to do. I mean, 72% of Americans still say that the support for Ukraine is good or should be more. And so I do not see that it would be wise strategically to try to alienate them by saying, I oppose that. And I think that in the Republican base, though, the threat, though, is that there is a solid 35-40% support for Donald Trump. Donald Trump, in any given primary, every state holds its own elections. Every party in every state holds its own elections for who the Republican candidate should be. He has enough to probably win primaries in almost all the Republican states, because when there's, let's say, 10 candidates, you don't need to win 50% of the votes to win a primary. You only need perhaps 25% of the vote. So with his 35 or 40% support, it's enough to win the primaries. So I think Haley, I mean, she was at the UN, so she does understand international issues better than I think most of the other Republican candidates. But that being said, I think that she's trying to reach to a different group of people, specifically those who think that Trump's policies towards Ukraine and towards Russia are insane, and wish to see the U.S. once again have a global role as it did prior to Trump's time in office.
But nevertheless, I mean, even if we look at everything that's happened, I mean, the diehard Trump supporters will always be there. We're not going to change that. But those a bit further afield, those wider, we're closer to Trump. Now, we've seen the world change completely since this all-out invasion. Is it maybe, are we giving him too much credit? I know we have to take him seriously, and he is a serious contender, but is that same sort of, let's say, that force that was there when he first won, is that really still there, or is that just has that disappeared because the world has now changed completely?
Trump has promised that he can end the war, as he's said a couple times, very quickly. And
in a day, he said, I think, with one phone call.
Yes, right? He said, which is just insane. I mean, the fact is that Donald Trump has little understanding of what's happening. And I think that's been seen throughout his presidency. I mean, there are some things where but was very aggressive and successful, such as trade. He was very aggressive on that. He did pressure NATO. But otherwise, when it comes to something that's not just about pressuring someone, which he seems to be good at, but it comes to actual strategic moves, he lacks that. And I see no ability or no signs that he has any comprehension of what happens to Ukraine outside of the idea, the conspiracy theories, I should say, that he does promote, and his own family, his own sons do promote conspiracy theories about Ukraine. that the money's being embezzled, that Zelensky's a cokehead who's using the money of American taxpayers to buy drugs. And it's just insanity. And so when you look at this and his circle of close people, such as his sons, we see that his worldview is based upon something that's not scientific or with a clear understanding of international relations, but based purely upon some sort of populist, rightist trash on Twitter.
There's also, you mentioned about disinformation, right? This powerful tool, I think, which we've seen how effective it is, not just in the US, but other parts of democracy all over. Do you think we've also learned the lesson as Americans, the West, doing enough to counter that disinformation?
Well, I think more could be done to counter disinformation. And we do see that Russia has been successful, and it was very active in spreading disinformation. I mean, just look at the dam break yesterday in Ukraine, the explosion. Immediately, massive amounts of disinformation started to spread. And if you look at the US population, I'm sure the vast majority believe the dam explosion was done by Russia. I have no doubt if we were to go look up rightist groups in social media, there would already be a clear underlying current of people saying it was really the Ukrainians, or it was really the Ukrainians using US weapons to do this, which has left 16,000 people without homes. The fact is that this disinformation is a real threat. And unfortunately, it's because it's masked as being free speech in the United States. Not enough is done to stop it. I mean, only official channels such as Russia Today, which do have to indicate that it is paid for by the government. But outside of that, when it comes to private citizens or even trolls or bots in social media, Russia is very active, and that's not enough is being done to control them.
Yeah. I know we have Zelensky's daily and nighttime addresses to his people. We don't have that with Biden. We don't have that yet. But do you think that kind of connection, talking to the American people, much like Roosevelt did, is that something that maybe could build up that support more and make sure the American people know what's going on around the world?
I think it would be fruitful that the White House addressed more clearly and more accurately, or I should say precisely, why the U.S. is doing what it's doing globally. I think that the average American does not have a strong understanding of that. Polling indicates that the average American does not have a strong interest in international affairs. If you look at any given poll, what is the decisive thing that you're going to vote for in this election? It's universally in almost every single election, the economy. And so if we look at IR, international relations, or we look at foreign policy, unfortunately, I think that more could be done to inform the Americans of why Russia's invasion of Ukraine is directly a threat to what might happen next in Europe. And that is the next step that the U.S. should be taking. I agree.
Yeah, so it's going to be a hard campaign for sure. Not the last time we'll talk about this, but of course, information will be a massively important factor in all that. Jason, always a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much.
Good to see you.
And thank you for watching. That's Sasha Farbach for TVP World. Stay tuned for more.